Today is November 4th, 1974, and I'm with Rabbi Klausner in Yonkers, New York. First of all, I'd like to begin with when did you first arrive in Europe, and when did you first encounter Jewish DPs?
My arrival in Europe was in early 1945. I encountered Jewish DPs actually when I entered Dachau concentration camp. That was just a few days after the camp was liberated.
Were there any chaplains in Dachau before you?
There were chaplains in Dachau before me who were attached to units, and as they moved through the area, they were in Dachau. The 45th Division, I believe, came through Dachau, and Chaplain Bonin was with the 45th, and he was there, and later on I heard from others who were attached to divisions that either came through or were in the vicinity that came by and spent an hour or a day or some period of time in Dachau.
And when you got to Dachau, your unit was then called away after a couple of days, is that correct?
Well, that's not quite correct. First of all, my coming to Dachau was in terms of an assignment. As it turns out, I was the first chaplain to be assigned, inadvertently actually, to a responsibility that was of a non-military nature. It seems that a request was forwarded to military headquarters in Paris, which was garbled. Actually, I saw the request, which made no sense, calling for a Jewish chaplain because of Jewish prisoners that had been liberated and were in need of a chaplain. The numbers given in the garbled message indicated that there was something wrong, but nevertheless, I was chosen as the chaplain to respond to that request, and consequently I came to Dachau, and I was attached to the 116th Evacuation Hospital. There were two hospital units pulled into Dachau, the 116th and the 127th, and their job was to try to save as many of the concentration camp victims as possible. And so my work began when I arrived in Dachau.
Specifically, what type of work are we talking about?
No one really knew what kind of work. When I came there was a chaplain attached to the 116th, and there was a chaplain attached to the 127th. They were Christians. There were no Jewish chaplains. And no one offered any type of a program for me, for saying that certain work had to be done. There was just utter confusion, and there I was, and no one paid any particular interest in me. And so the work that I was to do and the program that I was to establish was something that I had to decide upon and was of my own making.
Could we be more specific about what program that you initiated?
Well, taking it step by step, my first problem was to meet the DPs face to face. This was a difficult experience. The DPs were kept in barracks. They were surrounded by barbed wire. The liberation had taken place. They had no freedom. They could not move. Many of them were ill and dying. The medical staffs of the two hospitals were working day and night to try to save as many as possible. And the first job that I was actually called upon to perform was to bury the dead. The dead, of course, were in large numbers, and we didn't have the time nor the facilities to bury them one by one. What would happen was that during the day, after the mass graves were dug and the bodies that had been collected around the trains and the crematorium were buried in mass graves, then we started to bury them in individual graves. A crew would go out to the cemetery, Dachau, and they would dig up row upon row of graves. And then in the evening, the trucks would roll out with the bodies, and I would go out and conduct a service for the dead. And then I would return to Dachau, and following military procedure, we had a book that had to be initialed, and the names were listed. There were some names were full names, partial names. It was kind of a ragged business, and that became my first responsibility. Then I took it upon myself to start moving through the barracks themselves, meeting the people, talking to them. This was a very difficult emotional experience for many reasons. But eventually I got to the point where I was able to meet the people, and I began to work with them.
And what happened once you started working with them? They were in need of food, I assume.
No, they were not in need of food in Dachau. The Dachau camp, you must understand the Dachau camp. The Dachau camp was a what we call a feeder camp. It was a main installation, and Jews were not in the Dachau camp. There were Jews in there, but generally the Jews that were brought around the area were not kept in that camp. They were kept in what was known as the Kaufering camps. There were quite a number of them, outlying areas as far as Landsberg and beyond. But after the army had come through, these people were now gathered together, and they were brought into Dachau. And the problem was not feeding them in Dachau, because the army was feeding them, and they were opening up whatever stores were available, and these foods were being used to feed the people.
In sufficient quantity?
Oh yes, in sufficient quantity. In fact, a number of them died because they overate during the first period of time. And then many of them were sick, and they just couldn't eat. In fact, I recall the Klausner Rebbe, for example. I found him stretched out on a cot, practically dead. And what we were doing then was taking bread, chunks of bread, and as if it were a sponge, and dipping it into a pan of milk and just constantly working it against his lips and into his throat. And eventually, of course, he came around, and he survived. But the problem then was not a problem of food. The problem then was those who were beyond life itself and who were still condemned to death were going to die, and the army was there to try to see how many it could save. So that was the first problem. Then the second problem, and the problem that interested me, was the desire of the people, or the need of the people, to find out who they were in relationship to who survived. After all, they'd been cut off from the world. They still were. They couldn't move about. You couldn't send a letter or pick up a telephone. It was very interesting that for weeks and months it was illegal for a DP to write a letter and to have it mailed, or for a chaplain to take a letter from a DP and mail it.
This was illegal?
Oh, yes, it was illegal. We did it. We did it in large numbers. Others did it, too. It was one of the few things that all chaplains did. I'm sure non-Jewish chaplains did it also. As they came through and picked up these letters, they used their own, that is the military mail system. And it wasn't because the Army was against it. It was a matter of regulation. Regulation says that the mails are to be used only for military purposes, and you have no right to send civilian mail. You had a problem here, and this, of course, becomes something that has to be discussed in full. Who were these people, the DPs? Were they enemies? Were they friends? How were they to be treated? Actually, as it turns out, nobody knew. And this became a problem that we had to fight through until we got a directive called, I think, the August 22nd directive from Eisenhower, trying to spell out who a DP really was.
Mm-hmm. Now, were you involved in that?
Oh, yes, this was a basic fight, and actually, I think I have a note in one of the Sherita Plata volumes, which I published to this effect. But this became one of the problems, but it didn't manifest itself until later.
Is it worthwhile going into how you brought about this change, I would assume so?
Oh, yes, we'll take it step by step.
Okay, fine.
Recognizing that the problem was one of identity, it seemed to me that there was work to be done in that field. And so I set about, just to follow this particular thread for a moment, to find out who was in Dachau, who was in Landsberg, who was in the Kaufering camps. And as people came into Dachau and they discovered that I was there and moving about, they brought bits of information to me, telling me about what's happening in other areas. In many areas, the Germans were still in control because the army just moved through and liberated the Jews, but they were still being treated as if they were the enemies of the state. In fact, in one community, I got word from it that the Jews had been liberated, but the Germans are forcing them to live in the stables, things of that sort. And so I began to move about from Dachau, using Dachau as my headquarters.
The Army knew about where you were?
Nobody really cared. See, I was with this hospital, and a hospital unit is not similar to a strict military unit. And these people had come up from Anzio, and they'd had quite a career, and the war was over, and everybody else was moving about and just relaxing. But these people were still working. They were doing a very fine job. And I don't think they were really interested in anything that was going on. They were terribly upset with their own chaplains that were there because their chaplains were paying no attention to these people, and they were working day and night. And so they just let me be, and I went about my business, and I followed every bit of information, every whisper, every reference, trying to get transportation here and there, and starting to move about. Slowly, I began to widen a big circle around Dachau. Wherever I went, I got the names of the people who were there. And again, to keep the thread away from all others, because you just don't travel and say, give me a list of names. Once you get to a place, you're confronted with other problems, and so you start a secondary program going at the same time. For example, when I discovered that the Jews were still under Germans in hospitals, they had been dropped off wherever the liberation took place, and they were picked up, and they were back in German hospitals under German officials. And so I organized a hospital system and established hospitals. And these hospitals were our own, and we administered them. And within the first year, we had 3 big hospitals. One at St. Etienne, the other at Gauting, and the third in, I think we called Bogenhausen in Munich.
You were instrumental in setting up all of these.
Well, yes, I was instrumental, but all this has to be qualified. It isn't that I walked out on the street and said, here, let's establish a hospital. There had to be some reason why we were in St. Etienne. There had to be a reason why we were in Gauting and a reason why we were in Bogenhausen. And each one has its own particular story. But let's put it this way, that had I not gotten involved, there wouldn't have been a hospital at St. Etienne, and there wouldn't have been a hospital at Gauting, if that is the type of hospital that we want, or a hospital at Bogenhausen. Getting back to the first point, and so I traveled about and I collected lists of names, recognizing that this was the major problem at the moment because people outside of Dachau were moving around, trying to go back to East Europe and find family and so forth, and the rumors were flying like locusts in a plague. And strangely enough, as weak as people were, they didn't care. And it was illegal to travel. You had no identity. Therefore, you were an enemy. And you could be picked up. And there were curfews. And our people were arrested. I had to get them out of jail. So one thing led to another. Then I established a kind of a passport system. I started to issue papers entitling people to travel. This developed quite an art. In fact, we had, over a period of years, developed this whole system to the point where we were able to issue passports outside of Germany and were recognized by other countries until they discovered that paper was just a bit of nonsense. It also became important for me to establish a little underground of my own to get people out of Eastern Europe back into Germany, and especially with reference to children. When we heard that certain children were in Russian territory and Russians wouldn't let them out, we then established a program to get them out. We were somewhat successful. We've gotten out a number of children. In fact, there are a number of them living in Israel, and I see them even now from time to time. As I traveled about, of course, I became aware of the food situation. Where you had plenty of food in Dachau, you didn't have food in other areas. Because Dachau became a kind of a representation camp. All the journalists and people from the world over who suddenly became aware of the whole business of the concentration camp came flocking to Dachau, and Dachau had a general in command. Other camps were run by first and second lieutenants that were thrown off by the moving units. When the unit came across a camp, and didn't know what the commanding officer didn't know what to do with it, he just dropped off one of his officers and a couple of soldiers, a sergeant or two, and he usually dropped off the least of his organization. Obviously, there was no preparation for the whole DP problem and no recognition of its nature. I think this is true not only of the Army, but it's true also of Jewish organizations. Although there were many problems that the Jewish organizations faced over which they had no control, such as JDC, and which made their work that much more difficult. And so we had then the beginning of the She'eri Tapleta volumes. Now, the She'eri Tapleta volumes were printed. And now we're in 1945. There's no such thing as a printing press. No one is allowed to print. There is no paper. Now this, of course, was the beginning of my whole career of getting what I wanted and getting it done, one way or the other. And I got the first volume printed in Landsberg, which is kind of ironic. In the same town that Mein Kampf was printed, we had the first volume of She'eri Tapleta printed. And of course, each one of these moves involves God knows how many details, but that was one direction in which I went, the publication of the She'eri Tapleta volumes. Then, of course, at the same time, parallel to that, the establishment of the hospitals.
Could we be exact in terms of dates, if you remember?
Yes, we're talking now about the summer of 45.
Right, okay.
This is all this is happening at the same time. The hi, good to see you. This is the summer of 45, Now, of course, the question you might raise is, well, how was I able to do this? Well, certain things happened. Let me give you one example. The commanding officer of Dachau concentration camp, after the first officer was relieved, in the sense that all the publicity was over, and so they took the general out and they put a colonel in, had certain problems. One of his problems was to empty the camp, except he wasn't told how to empty the camp. The reason for that was that Dachau was going to become a processing center for the captured Nazis in a kind of a tribunal. You had the main court in Nuremberg, but there was going to be the lesser court in Dachau. And I came to him when I heard that he had this problem, and I offered to take the Jews out of Dachau. He was kind of taken aback that I should come and make this offer. And, well, just to recall again, I didn't make the offer directly to him first. I had made the offer to the medical officer, because I wanted to take the sick people out. And he questioned me, where would I take them and so forth, and I told him that I would take the sick to St. Etienne, I would take the TBs to Gauting and so forth, and he asked about these places, and he happened to be a very gracious man. And he asked...
his name?
No, but I could go back through the records. And he was fascinated by the fact that this kid, so to speak, was going to make all these offers of handling people and so forth. Well, he asked me if it would be all right for him to visit these places, and I said sure, and he did. The following day he called me in, and he said to me, you can have whatever you want. And they put at my disposal 10 ambulances, a crew of men. And instead of using the ambulances to begin to shuttle the sick to Gauting and St. Etienne, of course I would have to tell you how I came upon Gauting and St. Etienne. This would have to be worked back instead, but I didn't use it for that purpose. I then took these 10 ambulances. In the meantime, I ran into an Army officer, and strangely enough, that Army officer is now a member of this congregation. That's just a coincidence. In fact, I just prepared a little statement because of a gift they're giving us, recalling this particular time. This officer was in charge of a camp just outside of Dachau, just down the road. And when I had heard about this camp, I went over there. In fact, it was just walking distance. When I walked in, it was a rather interesting sight because no one moved. It was just a sea of beds, and it was quite dark inside. And I didn't hear a sound coming from any patient. And I saw one person moving about, and as he saw me come in, he moved towards me. And when we came together, I told him I just came up from Dachau, and I heard that the Jews were here. He said yes, and I said I would like to get to know the situation here, and he answered and said, it won't do much good because most of these people will soon be dead. Well, anyway, we became good friends, and he traveled with me now with the ambulances. Wherever we heard there were sick people, we took the ambulances and picked them up. In fact, that was the only time we carried guns, because we didn't want to fight or argue with the German staff. So by carrying guns and using them just symbolically from time to time, we got no arguments, and we were able to pick up as many as the doctor thought would live, and we brought them to the hospitals. And then eventually I got back to picking up the patients from Dachau and
What
moved
was the
them.
name of this particular soldier?
His name was Berkowitz. It's now Berk, Sidney Berkowitz. And you could get a story from him as far as his particular chapter was concerned. In fact, we traveled quite a bit. We even traveled up into the mountains down through Innsbruck, and there came across a very interesting situation with a group of Jews that had been taken into the mountains to be destroyed. So out of this we begin to get first the Sherita Plata volumes. We begin to get the hospitals, and then we begin to be confronted with the problem of gathering the people together, because many of the people were left just where they were while they were moving up or marching up from the south, north, and had really no place. And at this point in my work, I had thought that very soon there would be a recognition of the existence of these people by the world and by the United States and Jewish organizations, and I was convinced that very soon somebody was going to come and say, here we are, and come, let's do what's necessary to get these people out of here. And so I felt that the best thing would be to bring them together in Jewish communities, except that the Army wasn't ready to recognize such things as Jewish communities. In fact, the Army didn't want to recognize Jewish DPs. I had many run-ins, which I can tell you about, with the Army on this subject of Jews. But I was determined that there would be Jewish camps. And so I proceeded now to establish Jewish camps. That was the hospital program was part of it. I established Jewish hospitals. Now I couldn't go out and establish a Jewish camp on my own, although I had the idea. However, there were again certain conditions or situations that were festering that I could exploit. One was a camp called Feldafing. Feldafing was south of Munich, and what had happened there is that the DPs coming up from the south, being pushed north, were dropped off at a place called Tutzing, and they had to find a place for them, and somebody discovered this place called Feldafing, which was an SDAP school for youngsters. In fact, we had a whole warehouse of little Nazi uniforms there, and they were brought in there, and this unit dropped off a man by the name of Smith, Captain Smith, Jewish. Lieutenant, rather. Yes, lieutenant, later I think. And Lieutenant Smith now became the director of Camp Feldafing, and Lieutenant Smith turned out to be a very interesting personality. We didn't see eye to eye, Smith and I. He had a notion that the whole Jewish problem was in Feldafing, and that he was on top of it, and that he somehow was going to help these people. He was a good person, basically, except that he really didn't understand what was going on. And he had then developed a friendship with a chaplain who then and now posed quite a problem for me, a fellow named Browdy. Max, for me, was a strange personality in every way possible. Here he was in the middle of this whole mess, and he had some rank. He came over there, I think, as a major, and he was with headquarters. He walked around with his boots and his little crop and so forth, and spouted off all kinds of instructions and references and so forth, but really never got into the guts of the situation. Really had nothing to do with the DPs. And as a group basis, here or there, maybe got involved with a DP here, but actually never got, in fact, the big fight I had with him was when he came to me in Dachau, I remember. He was very angry.
What time was this?
This was again in summer of 45. I had come to the conclusion that the whole problem was a mess, and that it was way beyond us, and that somehow I had to get to the American Jewish community And so I then prepared a statement which I sent to Abihill Silver and Stephen Wise and somebody else. I like to believe that that resulted in the later Harrison study and report. But when he heard about it, he came to me and he was angry. And he said it wasn't true. It was fascinating. And I just stared at him. Here we were in Dachau. Miserable situation. And here he's arguing with me when I had written the report. Yes, they were getting food, but the calories they were getting and so forth, the conditions, they were still behind barbed wire, had no identity and so forth, no clothes, nobody was providing clothes for them, still wearing the gun. And he's standing there arguing with me that the Army is a good Army and they're sensitive to this. In other words, he wanted to feel that the things should come through him. Again, he and Smith really were unaware of the enormity of the problem, or what really was going on. They even had no anger in them, and they were just going to be good boys. And I would see Browdy from time to time. He'd come on little visits, as if it was a holiday to Feldefink, and spend some time with Smith and down at the house where the staff lived. And so Smith became the head of this camp. And one thing we agreed on was a Jewish camp. Now, how do you establish a Jewish camp? Well, in order to establish a Jewish camp, you've got to get the non-Jews out, and you've got to bring other Jews in. Now, that's where I came in. I had all the Jews in Dachau. And when I made the promise to the commanding officer there, the medical officer introduced me to the commanding officer then, and we became very good friends. We used to sit in the evening and talk. He was deeply disturbed by everything that had happened. He, like everybody else, didn't really realize that such destruction of human beings could have taken place. And he practically wept. At night we would sit there. And he too took the position that anything I wanted I could have. Wherein I was given the ambulances by the medical officer, I was given the trucks and transportation by the general command. Being off as a nurse and throw off on no evening. Seriously, I'll be but nurse and this yet, but okay. Yeah, look at me, you know. It's me right here with that. It's hard to be in a year, isn't it? Shelf for the sniff, you know again. Man, she was bad as she would have went shelf with her. Her in the team at the university in the cardboard, but no. What do you? You didn't know. Well, man, you're up like yes, and about. Besides, the real master, we're in there, do. The boss won't like you. I thought, if you get up to that, well, I give it yourself, you'll win it. You'll snap me early. If you miss it the first time, we'll win it or win it. That's next, and we get somebody in the other person. If I'll be water, process, and so, yeah. I don't know, but I said, hey, it's not, but said the world going, and I'm all to it. So, always not. Yeah, my pussy, not. What's that? Yeah, I'm saying, yes, it's new, man. I'm sorry, I've heard all, and that's enough to all you fire it all, and it's already, you got your last machine, get there with it. I ain't gonna do from me. And the video will be the third one. Wow, so some boxes, you'll snag them out. You're serious, yeah, but I'll make it too. Make it. So, yeah, here's the opposite surfing the wine. Well, I'd sit out if I do with him, and that, it's a nice little, but it is a fair like a faster, then, well, I'm thinking of that. Oh, you know, I'd get been open out of the top of it, if the house, if myself. If I mean, it must be 5 years, and there's a fall, because, the get feeling who's will be in the sun now. You never see fall one down. So it's never can one the house. Fine.
Nie, så ladder, det ser på den over årsene. Nå, det så snett for alt da på nå. Nå det kan alle ut. Nei, right. Det det up. No, wasn't this, well, yes, and do it too. You must be you now. Ja, bra, men vad sen om han inte heter för det så det var så att det är det hört sig så så. Och sen när vi går sen så det är nog bra att vi chat and search the video finder we are very fast search your name nej ska vara det staff with media what we no so power everything
To a camp that I had gotten and established completely. In other words, I had it emptied with all the people in there, called the camp at Wolfertshausen. I got the camp because I wanted it.
Where was that Wolfertshausen?
It's on the other side of Starnberg See, opposite Feldafing. I got the camp, and without the 20th Corps, I couldn't have gotten it. And had the people moved out, I have a legitimate claim to it, too. I mean, my argument was sound, and then I started to move people in. This is when we faced another problem. When the Jews were discovered that the eastern countries were not going to receive them, and those that went back found that they were going to face penalties from the Russians, which they didn't even dream of, that here suddenly these people would come back and they'd be tried as for treason. You had tremendous movements coming, and then when you had the pogroms again in Poland, people were coming across. It was illegal to come into Germany because the United States Army was determined to repatriate people. That was its great policy, get rid of them. That's the only thing it understood. We were trying to make all kinds of deals. And so I ran in trouble with Army on this because I took an issue contrary to Army, and I was constantly being threatened by Army, and I could go into a number of specific incidents. But basically, yes, this became quite a situation. And so we needed more camps, and I had obtained this camp at Wolfertshausen, and it was a complete new entity and had it filled up with people, but this came about by virtue of my relationship with Army officers. Now, we got to get back on some road here. What was, where were we going?
Well, we started from the beginning of what you were doing once you had come into Germany, into the concentration
Yes.
camps. And listing the number of
Yes,
things.
now, again, these were all the threads that began to weave in the tapestry. In other words, the identity of the people, the health of the people, establishment of Jewish camps, these were main issues and so forth, the identity of the people, the freedom of movement and so forth, and the fact that they didn't have to be repatriated. Many of these items are listed in the first volume of Sherita Plata, telling the people you don't have to go back, so forth. Now, at a certain point in time, I felt that...
Excuse me. Without this counseling on your part,
yes.
many people would not have known because the Army wasn't interested in telling them anything.
And that's not only wasn't interested, it was forcing them back, and I intervened at the price of court-martials. In fact, I could tell you the story of the camp right outside of Munich. You see, when Patton came up from the south, he was determined to get all the DPs out of the area. And so the tendency was to move DPs eastward, always closer to the eastern area. And we had, I think, 1,200 Jews in the camp outside. I think their name was Freisen. And they came to me in Dachau and told me the story that they're been ordered to move. All the others had been moved out already, and they were the ones that were left. And this started quite a situation because I had gone there and told them, don't move. And that's where I ran into Richmond for the first time. That's how I met Richmond. I told him not to move, and then I told the Army officer, captain there, I says, now listen, they're not going to move tomorrow. And, you as a captain should not make an issue of it. Just report it to your superior. Well, eventually it was reported all the way up, and I was called to headquarters. In fact, Richmond asked me to go with him to headquarters to explain to them the position because he was sympathetic. After he came down and he strutted in with his boots, you know, and again he looked at me and he thought that he would kind of tell me this is the best thing in the world and they were to go, and I looked at him and I said, cut it out. You can't do it. These people can't be shoved around. They want an address. They want to be able to mail a letter, get a letter.
How is it you weren't court-martialed on the spot for many of these things?
Well, because we have to come back to another story.
Okay.
You see, I wasn't court-martialed because nobody knew who I was. How were they going to court-martial me? I didn't belong to any unit because in the meantime the 116th had left.
And then there's the story of how I left with the 116th and then left the 116th and I was back again on my own. This is a story in itself. It's a fantastic story from my point of view simply because I don't understand it. It was an action on the spur of the moment. It was a dramatic experience within myself, and that's what happened. And here I am. Now I belong to no one.
Which is against Army regulations.
No, well, it isn't a question. I'm on no one's roster. No one's paying me any salary, and no one's looking after me. No one cares, except wherever I go, there people are interested in my work, and they help me. Yeah. I went to the 127th and told the chaplain I'd like a bed to sleep on. He said, sure. And then, of course, the head of Dachau, the military commander, after the hospital pulled out, they became a very good friend of mine. The medical commander, they would give me anything I wanted, so it didn't make any difference. That's how we got the paper, for example, for Unser Weg. We got it out of Dachau warehouses, you see. But to get back now to a previous point, you asked why I wasn't court-martialed. Anyway, coming back to this Freising case, I asked the people not to leave, and then I was called to headquarters. And there's when I discovered there were no Jews, because the officer in charge of repatriation for that particular area, I think that was either 7th Army or 3rd Army, before Patton came up. The 7th Army was in charge, and then 3rd Army came in. He had been in charge of moving the Japanese from the West Coast, so he was an expert in movement of people. No, this officer.
Do you remember his name?
No, I could recall, but at the moment I don't. Anyway, when I came to see him, and with Richmond, and Richmond said to him and the commanding officer, they came in, he very graciously said to him, listen, here's the chaplain, and he's involved with these people. Listen to what he says. Well, they weren't ready to listen. They were angry. First of all, they were angry at Richmond for bringing me. They were certainly angry with me. Again, my first lieutenant standing there telling them that these people are not going to move. And I kept saying Jews. And this officer says, there are no Jews in the camp. And there was a big board there showing which people have been, the Czechs have been moved out, and the Romanians have been moved out, and these have been moved out. And he says, there are no Jews. And of course, then I became a little bit ludicrous, and I says, then what the hell are you trying to do? What do you need 62 trucks for? No Jews, there's nobody there. And of course, this broke our plan of concentrating people in camps, because I then went back and said, listen, get out of the camp. And so that day, they broke camp, and they came into the city of Munich, and they began
How did they break camp?
You just walk out.
And nobody stopped them?
Who's going to stop them? I mean, after all, 1,200 people are going to... By this time, of course, you had two soldiers standing with guns there. No one's going to... The whole thing was kind of ridiculous at this point, and they just left. In some of the camps, they weren't really camps. After all, the Freising wasn't a camp to begin with. What was it? It was a German motor pool of some sort, originally. And so the people just broke camp and left and came into the city of Munich and found places to live eventually and so on. Well, prior to that time, I had decided that we've got to get organized, and that takes us into the story of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews of Germany, which I organized. And that became, of course, the so-called holding company, or the building of the institutional structure for all the work that was to take place after that. And this took place in Feldafink.
Again, during summer 45.
During summer 45. It can be pinned down in terms of dates because we have most of this information already, and Bauer's done most of the work on this. There are a few differences of opinion on exactly what happened, but basically what happened was that I had become terribly disturbed as to the food situation and other problems facing the DPs, and so I went up to headquarters in Munich, and I wanted to find who's in charge of all this. And I ran into a captain, an Irishman, and it was an interesting sight because when I came down the hall, there were a lot of people there in different camps. After all, besides Jews, there were many other displaced persons. And a lot of them were Volksdeutsch, you see, and they were well dressed and they got around, and they were making their demands too.
And I waited, and I heard all the complaints and so forth, and I then kind of sympathetically said to him, listen, you got a job, but I can help you. What can I do? I can take the Jews off his hands. Of course, he jumped to this. He kept questioning me again, how could you do this, and so forth, and I says, I can do it, and I have a plan. All you have to do is provide me with enough food and so forth, that certain needs, and well, he got excited about this, and he took me up to his commanding officers, floor above. I think his name was Elkins, I don't remember, Colonel. And he introduced me and said to him, here's what he's prepared to do. And I spoke, and he said, fine, we'll help you any way we can. And so with that as a kind of an indication that I might be able to pull off the organization of a committee, I then sent notices to all the camps in the area to meet in Feldafing, and had to provide transportation for them also, and so forth. And we met in Feldafing. And there we went through a series of experiences with Smith and with Browdy, which were ludicrous.
Can you be specific?
Yes,
I know
we,
Brown mentioned some of it in his book, but...
We met, and first of all, the question came up as to where we would meet, the place in the camp. This was interesting because Smith was antagonized by this meeting. He didn't want it, actually. I think he felt threatened by it because here he had become the dominant, or he felt that he was a dominant figure and so forth. King of the Jews. Anyway, so we met on a little porch outside of a door of a little apartment and so forth. We were all sitting around a table, and Dr. Grinberg presided. He came in from St. Etienne. And it was interesting because the procedure reminded one of a tea party in Never Never Land. Because here you were in the middle of Feldafing, and the whole procedure was as if you were back in Kovna, and you're going to have a nice little meeting, and you're going to call upon the distinguished guests to speak first. And so Grinberg called upon Browdy, and Browdy was happy to be there. And then he called on Smith, and I'll never forget Smith's speech to them. He spoke a broken Yiddish. In the first days of liberation, the Red Cross was active, just in the first couple of days. And they had stocks of prisoner of war packages. And so they distributed these packages. But their term of service came to a quick halt because they were not allowed, according to Army, to have anything to do with the picture. And so maybe in 3, 4, 5 days they helped out with whatever stores, and after that they were out of the picture. In fact, I didn't realize what their role was because I became terribly upset and went down to a town where their headquarters were and made issue of it. Well, anyway, Smith was able to get more Red Cross packages because he wasn't far from the source. And the Red Cross package was a good package. It was an interesting package because it's the beginning of the black market, the Red Cross package. And the black market is an interesting study in itself. It's really not a black market. It's the real market. Everything else was the black market, but what they call the black market was real. And unless people analyze really what happens in a black market, they don't understand. The name black market really is not appropriate. Well, anyway, people wanted these packages. And so he greeted these people by making the following speech, which consisted of the fact that if they would go back to their camps and keep them sober, clean, they too could get Red Cross packages. This was the whole tenor of the meeting, and I sat there and I fumed. I got so angry that I rose and I just brought the meeting to an end. I said, this is the most ridiculous experience, and that if there's any further interest in what I am there for, we will meet again in the kitchen. And so that broke up. Now we went into the kitchen. And in the kitchen we organized the Central Committee of Liberated Jews of Germany. And now after we had organized it, we elected officers and all that. I now went back to headquarters to the colonel to tell the colonel that I'm ready.
And I had found a place where to set up our offices, and that was the Deutsches Museum in Munich, a bombed-out building. I had gotten to the Deutsches Museum for one of my visits, because UNRWA had established a kind of a passage center, people moving through, but stopped there, and they had a kitchen and so forth. And I had spoken to the UNRWA leader there and asked him about the rest of the building, which was pretty well bombed. Told him I'd like to come in here too. He says, fine, you can come right in. Well, anyway, I went back to headquarters and went in to see the colonel.
This is Colonel Elkins.
I think his name is Elkins, something like that. And before I could say anything to him, he said that he was terribly sorry that I could not proceed with my plan, that Army was against it. Now, the Army was fighting with UNRWA all along, and the question of who controls camps and so forth was always an issue, and Army insisted that it was to control camps. And then there was a battle within Army whether G5 section controls it or one of the military units control it. And so you had these fights going on. As a result, we didn't know during the first period of time just how camps were to be administered.
Do you know any place where that is written about in terms of this inter-army?
No, but I'm sure that all this can be documented.
Yeah, I just wondered
Yes.
if there was anything written.
And I think that Abraham is very much interested in this particular point. Well, he informed me that we couldn't go ahead with it. As far as I was concerned, I didn't care what he said. I wasn't paying attention to anybody anyway. However, something very interesting happened then, which changed the whole course of our work. As I turned to go, he called to me again. He said, Chaplain, do a good job. And this became my kind of protection. And so now the two things happened together. The committee was established and the Camp Freising was broken up. And so many of the people of Freising came to work with me at the Deutsches Museum. And we got lumber and everything from Dachau with the trucks and brought them down and built stairwells and set up offices and so forth, and we were in business. And this became the beginning of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews of Germany.
What was your function during this, in terms of the committee?
How
did you operate?
I was the head of the committee.
You were head
I was
of-
not the elected head,
Yeah.
but I was the head of the committee in the sense that the committee couldn't do anything. They were still DPs.
Mhm.
They were still subject to curfew. They had no identity. In other words, what I was doing is taking the people and beginning to build up a people's representation. And this is what Browdy and Smith were against.
Browdy was definitely opposed to
Oh,
that.
yes. I mean, he absolutely did nothing to help us or to indicate any interest. I don't even believe he ever came down to the Deutsches Museum. Never part of the committee and so forth. But here was the question of who was going to determine
And what about policy decisions? How was that determined on the committee?
the committee.
What was your role in that?
Well, the policies that we were developing were never discussed until much later, as I'll tell you the first time the policy situation occurred. Everything followed according to my plan. And my plan was not a thought-through plan. I didn't sit down and say, this is what we're going to do, A, B, C, D. I worked in terms of the moment. And then had to relate myself to the reality of the situation. For example, when I came into Feldafing one day, and Levi Shalit stopped me. I didn't know who he was then, tall, gangling fellow, and says to me, Chaplain, he says, we need a newspaper. So my immediate answer to him was, you'll have a newspaper. Now, I had no idea where you get a newspaper or anything, and I had no idea how you go about it. And my answer was contrary to my original philosophy. If we're going to get out of there right away, what do you need a newspaper for? You see? Except that I was also convinced that whatever happens has to happen with the people and through the people. If the people wanted a newspaper, which I thought immediately would be a good thing, then we've got to get them a newspaper somehow. And then from there on started the plans of developing, and we did. We got the type, and we got the paper, and we got the printer, and we got the money, and all this, the black market working one item against the other. And eventually we we had a newspaper. And of course, the dating of the newspaper is there. We can tell you when the first issue came out. And we had a big celebration in St. Etienne when the first issue came out. And I gave Shalit my fountain pen because that was the only way I could indicate to him that he had done a wonderful job, because he was the one that got the type, you see. And from there on, we were in the... So when it came to a question of principle, at that point there wasn't established the question of principle. Later on, the question of whether we should have Jewish camps or not Jewish camps became an issue. I remember one incident which involved a principle, or the beginning of a principle. At one point, the British offered to take whatever children we had to England. Again in 45, 46. This would be 45, would be late 45 perhaps. It's documented. It's in Inland Bay. You can get the date because the issue is the British offered to take the children. Now, no one ever spoke to the DPs. No one ever came to them and talked to them or discussed anything with them. They were not entities of any sort. They were things that had to be moved around. And so a decision was made someplace that the British will take the children out of this bad environment and take care of them for a while. Somehow the decision got to me. How these things got to me now I can't always trace, except somebody came along. I remember once when the first few certificates were offered for DPs to come to Israel before it was Israel. They were brought to me. Somehow when an army officer or somebody got some, by this time everyone knew that I was the focal point. Now in all this time, because you're writing on the subject of chaplains, we had no assignments of any sort. No, there were no DP chaplains at this point. DP chaplains aren't assigned until much later, until the whole institution of the DP chaplain is established. And at this particular point, there are no chaplains at all in the area. They come and go. My point again, just pull me back to my point. Oh, yes. So we got the notice on children. And so the word got to me, and I went around finding whatever children. We didn't have many children, because after all, the youngsters were all killed by the Nazis. We had some 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and many of them were with the Klausner Rebbe down in Fürstenfeldefing, and then I had to move over to Fehrenwald. But there were some children around, and we collected them. And we took him out to the airport in Munich, and we were going to send him to England. Now you picture this. There are the children, and I have brought out the members of the committee with me. They had nothing to do with it. In other words, they had no power of any kind. The children were brought by UNRWA people, and I was there, and the British were going to send the planes, and the children were going to be taken. They had no parents, so they didn't have any parents to object to it. And the planes were supposed to come at a certain hour, and they didn't come. And we waited. And the planes didn't come that day, so they told they'll come tomorrow. And so now we go into the second day. It was at that point that the first position was taken, principled position. Our children will not go.
Why was it made later, not on the spot?
Well, you have to understand the situation. These people are still, they're just beginning to grasp power of some sort of their own being. After all, they're still, any little sergeant or soldier could slap them around. And that's what happened. They were subject to the whims of the military police. No papers, no identity, and they hadn't come to the point where they could begin to feel that there was some strength. And it was at that point where they said no, and we decided, that is, they decided, I didn't make the decision, because I was there to see to it that the children did get on the plane. Except when they made that decision, that became, there was no argument about it.
Were you in favor of the decision once it was, I mean...
Oh, yes. I understood the decision, and there was no question about it, because the emotion of the decision was tremendous. They were saying, what is, we lost all our children, now we're going to give away these children, and children were important at this particular juncture. And so this became in question of my relationship. This was the first time that I can remember in terms of my relationship with the committee that decisions were now going to be made by the people themselves. So we had a number of conferences and so forth.
Would you say you were an advisor?
No, I was not an advisor. I was the committee. In other words, I set up, I got the offices, and I ran them, and I got the food, and I got the transportation, and I got the hospitals, and I got all the material, and fought the battles, and so forth. In this initial period, I set up the offices. I published the She'erita Pleta volumes, 1 and a 2nd, and then we set up a department to elaborate on it, to get more names. People came. Of search under JDC or somebody else, UNRWA and so forth. This is absolutely untrue. If there was, it was way up somewhere where it had nothing to do with the people. But actually, the officers, the people working, and we have a man here in New York who actually was in charge of this eventually, an engineer, and he did a wonderful job.
What's his name?
I'll have to recall the name. I know him quite well. All these names have to be recalled.
Yeah.
And he was then, by the time we were in Munich at Siebertstrasse, we moved from the Deutsches Museum to Siebertstrasse.
When was that?
Well, again, we'd have to go back to dates. Now, we were thrown out of Deutsches Museum, and that was by a 7th Army officer. The 7th Army officer came in, a colonel, and he sent 2 of his officers, a captain, lieutenant, one day, and came up. And they looked around our offices and told me that we have to get out. They weren't going to tolerate this business. And at this moment, I simply looked at him and said, if that is the order of your commanding officer, you go back and tell him that he's wet behind his ears. He doesn't know what he's doing. And so they went back and they told the officer that I said that he was wet behind the ears. Well, that created a problem. And so he sent for me. And he told me he'd been in the Army many years. No one talks that way about him. I tried to explain to him that he shouldn't take it personally because I'd never known him, therefore I couldn't make a personal reference. I says, however, anybody that could take a position to destroy this particular institution, which is vital for the movement of peoples through this central area, Munich, which has become the hub, is asking for a lot of trouble because these people are going to constantly come here.
Do you remember who this particular officer was?
No, I'd have to, again, go back and try to find some reference to it. Well, he wasn't satisfied. He was terribly angry, and so he told me that he was going to institute court-martial's proceedings. Yeah, I didn't take this seriously because it just didn't sit well in the sense, well, how is he going to court-martial me, where, and so forth. In fact, before I went and left the office at 3 Siebertstrasse, I said to one of the JDC people, I says, well, I'm going to see how this is going to work out. I'm going to try to get lunch out of him. But I didn't. I got no lunch out. After he had threatened me, I then went to see Colonel Richmond, who now had headquarters in Munich. And by this time I was very friendly with the colonel. And I would eat at his table. You see, I had no place to eat. I had no unit. And I'd left Dachau by this time. And I was now living in the building on 3 Siebertstrasse, which I got from a property control officer. I remember his name because I get a card from him every year, a fellow named Silver, and he was the one that helped me publish the final volume of She'erita Pleta, which was a complete volume. In other words, we redid all the other volumes, right. And that was a big job, and he was the one that made it possible. Paper, printing, everything in Munich.
What was his first name?
I think Jack. He was the property control officer for the Army in Munich. Well, anyway, I went to see Richmond, and I remember coming in and saying to Richmond, I said, somebody's in trouble. I don't know who it is. It's either your friend, I mentioned the officer's name, or me. And I told him the story. Now, Richmond lived like many of the officers, ranking officers, after the war. They got themselves these big homes, and they had staff, and especially if you were in charge of a small unit, and you had your rations, and you had your women, and you had everything that made the victory sweet. And so he had this big table, and I would come every once in a while and sit down and have a meal. And he was very fond of me. I think he liked what I was doing. And he even tolerated the fact that I stole his gasoline. So after all, we had transportation. By this time, we had collected a number of vehicles for our committee. But we had to have gas. And so I would go past his gasoline dump and, pick up the jerry cans and load them up and go. He knew it all the time and so forth. And when I told him this, he said, fine, let me take care of it. And he invited the officer for dinner with a number of other ranking officers. And I was also at that dinner. And the result was that I would agree to leave Munich. And if I ever ran into the captain or the lieutenant, I was to indicate that I had been court-martialed. This was how we solved the case, with the exception that I wasn't going to leave Munich. I'd agree to.
I don't understand this. What do you mean?
Well,
this particular officer believed that you were court-martialed?
No. The officer who was going to court-martial me was at the dinner.
Uh-huh.
And the agreement was that Richmond asked him not to, and, friendship. But on the other hand, he wanted to save face, and
with his
junior officers. That, in other words, they should be under the impression that I was court-martialed, and so after all, I had said something about it. So I don't know how we got to this point. Something led up to this. We have to get back to some other point. Well, anyway, we got a central committee going. And with the committee, we now have a number of functions. We have the tracing bureau, which is the names. We have a newspaper going. We have the establishment of Jewish camps. We have the program of bringing the Jews across the border from East Europe. We have an underground going into Europe, especially looking for children. We have a program for manufacturing of clothing and the stealing of clothing and food wherever we could find it, warehouses and so forth. Making deals with Germans who had hidden stuff and we had found it. For example, when the German crowd hid shoes, tremendous shoes. We discovered that the shoes were there. I didn't discover it personally, but word got to me. People were always bringing the information. And we forced the Germans into a kind of a deal where we would get a portion of the shoes that were turned over to the Munich committee, things of that sort.
Do you remember how you did that particular deal?
It was very simple. The word got to me that there were shoes, and fine. I then went to see the people who shoes, and they played it very calmly that they have the shoes and they're not interested in anything. And would they be interested in selling the shoes? Of course not. They wouldn't be interested in selling the shoes. And then, of course, we'd say, well, if you don't want to sell the shoes, you're going to lose off of them because we're going to take them. We're going to force them. And
did you have to use your gun?
No. We the only time that I used the gun was when we got patients. But after that, by this time, you see, that was at the beginning. And at this point, I had gained a lot of position and power in terms of movement and people and so forth, and I had no fear as to. You see, my basic fear was always that sooner or later this is all going to end. I mean, somebody's going to get me, and that would be all over. And the question was, is it worth it? In other words, I don't want to end here. But by this time, I felt that I was pretty well protected in terms of my relationships and so forth, and I feared no one. And wherever there were stocks of material and I wanted it and felt that we were entitled to it, we were going to get it. Unfortunately, I think the mistake that was made by Army and everybody else was that people weren't treated the way they should have been treated in terms of being given the things that they needed. Army wasn't prepared, had no organization for it. Even the food, for example, that the people ate could not come from Army stocks. Had to come from German stocks. The Army could replenish the German stocks as they did, but basically, according to regulation, you had to get the food from the Germans. And this created problems too. I ran around in many camps because the Germans didn't give the food, and the officers in charge didn't know how to get it. In fact, they went to the Germans. Germans said, "We can't give you any food, we don't have it," or didn't give enough, and so you had rebellion on the part of the DPs. They didn't understand that to deal with the Germans at that time, you had to be very harsh, and you had to threaten. And this is precisely what we did. Well, again, this was another activity of our organization. And then we started the package program. That was kind of an interesting sideline.
Okay, now, are we going to just deal with it superficially for the moment, or are we going to go into it?
I'll give you the whole package program because it's very simple and very quick. As a chaplain, I never conducted any services. I only conducted in the first period 2 services. One was a service at the Munich cemetery, and the other was the High Holy Day services of 45 in Munich at the Prince Regenten Theater. Now, the reason that I conducted those services was that Chaplain Wall, who was with the 9th Division, came to me and asked me to conduct them because he was going to be with his unit. And I felt fine. So I conducted the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services at Prince Regenten Theater. And during the Yom Kippur service, instead of delivering the sermon, I brought a meal from Dachau and put it down on the stage. And I said, "This is the food we eat." And I said, "And the clothes we wear." And told the story and the things we do. And you could be of help to us. I told the place was filled with GIs. You can help us. Packages. Send packages. Now, where do you send them? I have no address. 9th Division. Wall's address. Well, it never occurred to me that these packages were going to come in an avalanche. Well, shortly thereafter, Wall would come with a Jeep the first day, truck the next day, a mammoth truck the next day, dropped them off. Then he came in fear. He's frightened. He says the whole camp is inundated with packages. He's been called on the carpet. Yes, that. Inspectors are coming down. In the meantime, we were faced with the problem, what do you do with the packages? So we got a warehouse in Munich.
How?
Oh, this wasn't a problem. You just find a warehouse and you get it. Go to the property control officer, or you find a warehouse and you say, "This is ours," and put a lock on it. If the German says it's ours, then fine, we'll use it. We'll give you a package. He had no use for it at the time. And we had a fellow by the name of Jochelson. In fact, he just retired as the educational director up in Montreal. He actually took care of the business end of these things.
Is it worthwhile to speak to me?
If you want to, just this part of the story.
No,
I mean,
right.
no. So, they're all people I worked with across the years. So we then started breaking down packages, and you had to put up an assembly line to break them down. It was an interesting study in what was in those packages and so forth. And
What was in them?
well, basically what was in them, some of the things that were amusing. First of all, we collected tons and tons of medical samples, which you couldn't use.
Right.
First of all, you couldn't read them. Who's going to read them? Secondly, you couldn't fit them into the European medical structure. You can't take a little drug, you don't know what it is, and so forth, and who are you going to give it to? And so, I mean, you can't do it. Medicine has to be handled systematically.
American doctors?
No. First of all, American doctors were not serving us anymore. We only had our own. This is also part of our change. By this time, the Army officers were all pulled out. We didn't
So
have
we're
any...
talking again about after Rosh Hashanah, Yom
Oh, by that time, sure, the Army was all gone. We were now in a different problem. We had our hospitals were now being staffed by Jewish doctors, except that we had to use some Nazi doctors too. And then we had a big fight over it because the patients wanted us to keep the doctors, and the Army wanted to process them for punishment, and I had to beg to leave them. So, I mean, at least for the time until we could get Jewish doctors in. And this too became part of our problem. Anyway, the packages had these items. Then they had another interesting thing that always amuses me when I think of it: vests, men's vests by the tons, without jackets or pants, but vests that people were going with. And then, of course, some had bits of food and things of that sort, and old clothes. And in fact, we once had a run-in with the Klausner Rebbe, who was always finding fault with me. And one of the issues he made brought in the inspectors, actually, because he complained to the inspectors that we were stealing his packages. Of course, the whole thing was ludicrous because no packages could be sent to anybody.
Right.
And we went to the warehouse and, started to look at the packages and so forth, and he pointed to the packages that were his. And what he was pointing to were black garments, because all black garments were being sent to him. It didn't amount to much in terms of the whole argument or anything of that sort, but this was... Well, anyway, Wall was finally brought up for charges, court-martial. And I think, like in many of the cases, they just decided to ship him out and forget about the whole thing. I don't know just what he had to go through. I never discussed that point with him. But he was the one that carried the brunt of it. We got the packages and he got the brunt, and we just maintained that package program until it petered out. And the interesting thing about it is it's really the first CARE program. See, later on, CARE was instituted, but at this point it was illegal. But later, when CARE was instituted, we no longer needed it.
Now, how long are we talking about? From what?
Oh, we're talking about a program that ran for about a year.
So from
the
sometime
beginning.
after Yom Kippur,
That's right, beginning
1945.
45 and for a year after 45. And then later packages, then you got into a different phase. People who were writing to us, visited, came, saw us, and we wanted specific items, medical instruments and so forth. People were writing, and the city of Rochester started to send clothing and shoes, and whenever materials were being sent, they felt the safest way to do it was to send it to me or through me, because then they had every assurance that it would be properly handled and delivered.
How important were these packages, would you say?
How important? Looking back, I would say they weren't terribly important. They served the purposes in the sense that they provided for the establishment and the progress of the black market. Here and there it may have served a need, but...
Were the people who received these packages, do you think it was a moral uplift for them in terms of finally somebody was sending them material?
No, these were not those packages. They were more or less old stuff. They weren't, you didn't find a beautiful package of fine things. That came later. I remember much later when I was up in Kassel, which is the second phase of my work. It falls into two basic phases. When I was in Munich, and then in the north in Kassel when I was sent out away from Munich as a danger to the structure there. There we were already beginning to get cases of material, and new material that was being sent to us by organizations, institutions, and they were being turned over to me there. But by that time, again, the problem was no longer severe as it was in the first months.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it could have been a more effective setup if...
Oh, sure, if people had known and people were able to. We eventually have to get into the situation of JDC.
Well, why didn't, if these GIs were told by you what the situation was,
Yes.
and many of them had seen the situation for themselves,
I don't know how many.
Oh, you
but,
don't know?
No, I wouldn't assume that all
but
of them.
American jury should have known by that time for sure.
No. Even Browdy's argument with me was indicative of the situation until Harrison came.
All right, but Harrison, was, the report was out by that time?
No.
By 46 for sure.
46, yes, but don't forget from 45 you had a year already.
Okay.
Okay, that was the crucial year.
Mhm.
Yes, sir.
So in overall terms, it wasn't particularly an effective program, but...
There was no program.
Well, I'm
But
talking in terms of the packages.
it was a program in the sense that it provided the leadership. For example, we couldn't pay the leadership,
Mm-hmm.
so they could go down into the warehouse and choose a necktie or shirt and things of that sort. In other words, it became our treasure house, our storehouse, and then the rations that we gave to the different workers on different committees. And it served a purpose in the sense that there were a lot of people who would have nothing to do with the committee and the work. They would run off, or they would just stay in their camps. You had to collect about you people who are willing to start assuming responsibility. Well, they wanted a certain amount of prestige or recognition, and this gave us, it also afforded us an opportunity to exchange and get some money. After all, we're running a whole organization now with no treasury.
Mm-hmm.
We have no money, no
So it was
income.
important then.
Well, certainly it was. In terms of, it generated certain, for example, if you got a case of cigarettes, you were in business, and we had no cigarettes delivered to us, and therefore we had to find ways of generating currency, any kind of currency. But once you're generating some currency, you can always make your exchanges and keep going.
I'm told that there was a meeting in November of 45, was it, that you called with regard to the packages?
I don't know what
You
meeting
don't
that would have
remember?
been.
In other words, you got together some chaplains to do this on a more
I may have,
widespread
but
basis?
I have no direct recollection of it. I remember talking with, of course, with Wall, and I'm sure that I discussed it with Lippman.
Yeah, but this was a meeting. Rabbi Lippman said in particular he remembered, and he couldn't remember who was there, but
Yeah.
that
Possibly,
that you
but
had called the
yes,
meeting.
but I have no recollection of it. It could have happened, and
Okay.
it would be in keeping with my, I have some idea that I met with the chaplains and tried to get them interested or involved in some way.
This was during this early period in Munich.
Yeah,
But you don't recall...
I couldn't give you any detail on it.
Okay. What we've done to this point is go over a general view of what took place during these early months.
Yes.
Now, is there anything more general you'd like to talk about, and then maybe we can go back and deal with some specifics in greater detail?
Well,
In other words, we're dealing with the Munich period now, which
yes.
is...
Well, actually, it's not the Munich period. Munich is the point of departure. For example, by this time, my camps range from Munich down to the south to Innsbruck, and up into the Nuremberg area.
How many camps are we talking about?
We are now talking about. You see, there were a lot of them at the beginning, and then they were dissolved. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 or 12 units,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 15 units,
Camps.
camps and so forth, different kinds of units. So by this time, we have drawn our circle quite. In fact, up to this time, we have everybody involved except the camp in Frankfurt. I had no relationship with the camp in Frankfurt, outside of Frankfurt. That was established, because that was what happened was that the Frankfurt camp was established, and the advisors on Jewish affairs were stationed in Frankfurt, and they were close to it, and so they developed a kind of a relationship there. For example, Abe Hyman could give you the whole story of the Frankfurt camp and so forth. But all policy and so forth, with reference to the whole picture,
emanated from Munich. In other words, Frankfurt was not a place where meetings were held or principles were established. It all happened out of the Munich enclave.
Okay. You want to go now back to some of the specifics that we talked about
Yes.
before?
It's up
Or-
to you.
Okay. One of the questions that we spoke about was the DP status.
Yes.
How did this develop? The Army had a policy of repatriating.
Well, let's go back
okay,
before that.
fine. All right,
The Army came into Germany, and it made a distinction between allies and enemies. Now, there were enemies, like, for example, Hungary was an enemy nation. It didn't stop and make a distinction between a Hungarian Jew, who was a DP, and the Hungarian nation. Therefore, on the first days, Hungarian Jews were forced in battalions to clean up the rubble in Munich once they were discovered to be Hungarians. A distinction had to be made there. Those that were in camps were not permitted out of camps. There was no such thing as an identity card. The guards, the soldiers were on guard at the gates of camps. In other words, they were back in prison, so to speak.
With the electricity on in the wire.
No, these were just, they weren't concentration camps. These were just camps, like Feldefing had some barbed wire strung across it, and they had a couple of soldiers out there all the time. And, of course, the camp directors were given the order, the military people, you can't let these people go. If you came into Smith's office, for example, or later on we had a fellow by the name in Landsberg, we had a fellow by the name of Friedman.
Then Padna. Self, you can be self, for red open there's no service out. And there's a volume on the survey representation it kept a lot of well now he goes eat did the smart but there's again the well better. And so when they robbed that the emerald, the scars no one earth. Yeah, I know there is a role, you're rating it lucky and then pass it you're open, you read it with the nurse and the grave shops and then she always just say there I guess we no fashion said yes nee Miss Max so is the way it was now she always just in fact but troll that's not whether we own that she always just in fact for the memory read she has to be her their arm jump sit the 5 p.m. Well, if you're of the we lead my boosters of Andres or with the fancy ropes and she always just look at it from with it. So but we must be so up. No, it's so I don't get near with Saki. He makes her so far must with your need that. Her off, but them said there was not. So she always just name so be as yeah, that all see that basket. You know it's a little bit so I don't know. Oh, about her. Oh, well, no one saw you. Well, for off, make it up. She's a silver off, yamned. Well, I was in it, say, yes, you. Sorry, I won't sure if Miss Mead, down in them, still with those in there, food. You're making that. I said, fuck you, we had a. She always got snake, gets upset on snake, she was too bad, so me, either. Snake and girls, so I will be from person you won't to me, say, I know. Well, there's five young them ships in it. Well, if you won't, there was the fact that we had it. You know, if you ask us, see if he's walking on you, was charging, so we. And I'm still remaining up on her, so it. And then there's the fog, you know, hard dress of all for them in the same hour, if you were running it up, well. You know, it's so out of wind. There's the fog, you know, with that. No, it's just near the Mary, the wishing chiller, or you're saying, yam, and they look as you might have it. You know, it's so out of the wind that there's a hot you might with one to say it. No one for some, you know, well, so that you will be the Albert reply, and no, then she has in Grobman work, you see this, Grobman work, you might want to. It's they need Albert, so there's no one to go for us, and then you let them, I thought the one I'd scratched in this one. So you make not open in the gypsy and you're being a boy feel on them, so that's out them, the way the name out fells and she's the fair see too. And there's the other cat, but shall they can go with the nipple, cat and the cat, you know, each beast cat. Name and nurse your friend out of spells and she's so everything we do in that. som det andre så sa nej. Alright, so we since so I wrote so this will go out that's mun I word. So I wrote so this on that
Principle level, where our concern's only on a pragmatic level.
Right, and how did you deal with that on a pragmatic level?
We just, we went to the border and we sent our trucks and we brought the people over.
All right, well, we'll get to that.
Yes.
The question of freedom for the DPs.
That's right. Identity, movement, accept mail, all these things. So
Okay, have we dealt with that sufficiently, you feel?
well, these were some of the problems. We dealt with them, for example, I would take letters and put them in packages and send them to JDC here in New York and say distribute them.
How about getting them out of the camp?
Getting the people out of the camp?
Were they allowed to walk outside of the camp, etc.?
Well, we started the business with these papers, you know, kind of instructions.
How
We
did
mimicked-
maybe we should go into that now.
It was a very simple matter. It just, I took a piece of paper and put it, you know, in a mimeograph machine, and a letter to the authorities to permit this individual to do the following, to move about or something of that sort, and
How did they get out the front gate?
piece of paper.
And
And then again, the camps, after a while, they couldn't, two soldiers, they didn't really do this seriously. They'd go through the back gate, go this way or that way, and so forth. It was the curfew, which was a big problem. You couldn't be on the streets after a certain
And
hour.
how did you deal with that problem?
Well, you couldn't deal with that, except that if I were driving in a car, now we had a meeting and I had to take some of my representatives, so I would take them. But this was something that you couldn't really lick, and then every once in a while some of our people were picked up and taken to jail, and then I would have to go the following day or something and talk to the judge and get them out.
And there was really no one else to be able to do that?
No, no one.
Okay. There was nothing else on the DP status that...
No, that was on my level. You see, the problem was there. I was not in a position to resolve it in terms of principle with the United States Army.
So you just had to circumvent it? in
That's
any way?
right, circumvent it and to make issue of it. In other words, what we would do is make issue of it, we'd call strikes.
Oh, all right, let's hear about that.
Oh yes, in other words, when an issue was at hand and we wanted to get a hearing,
For example?
well, I don't remember what the issue was. The press was housed in Nuremberg for the trials, and they were housed in a place called the Faber Castle. I think the Faber Pencils. I think that was the firm. And what we would do is, when an issue was at hand and we couldn't force it in the sense that we couldn't get a hearing, I would go up to the Faber Castle, and I'd gotten to know a number of the journalists, and I would tell them there's going to be an uproar or a strike or a march the following day or the following week in Munich, and they would come down and they'd cover it, and then of course we'd get the coverage, and the Army would be upset by it and so forth, but at least after it was done, we'd get a hearing on it, and I would say that practically every case we had right on our side. In other words, the issue should have been handled. Now, when Joint came into the picture, Joint was faced with so many problems and so many limitations that it couldn't be of help to us during this period. And so...
You mean May through August?
Well, it took much longer. May through August is out completely. They couldn't do a thing. Even after August, they couldn't do much. You see, they went through a number of phases. First of all, the UNRWA insisted that JDC personnel be attached to UNRWA teams. One of the stories that still has to be told, and somebody will tell it eventually, is UNRWA under Lehman. Governor Lehman was in charge of it. And Lehman did a very bad job. I don't think he did a job at all. And what problem JDC had in other agencies, all of them, all the voluntary agencies, was that they were not permitted to operate on their own. They had to operate under UNRWA. UNRWA had the team concept. In other words, you go into a camp with a team. Except that Army wouldn't allow UNRWA to operate a camp. The camp was under a military ruler. The military people didn't care a damn about UNRWA. So now you have the first problem JDC not being able to operate on its own. It has to be part of UNRWA. UNRWA can't operate because of the battle with Army. Under these circumstances, there was very little they could do. They certainly couldn't bring in materials. They certainly couldn't address themselves to the people in terms of their problems directly. They had Army and UNRWA to go through. And UNRWA didn't really appreciate or understand the problems. Until this problem was resolved, eventually it was. And JDC came into our building on Siebertstrasse with a headquarters, moved in, and so forth. And then eventually began to relate themselves to the camp work. Even then, they weren't able to take over.
Do you remember
camps.
exactly when they really started working effectively?
No, but we can work it out. I remember when Eli Rock was the first JDC man to come. He came to Munich in a 3/4-ton truck. And just to give you a kind of a vignette of how it impressed us, he drove into the inner circle of the Deutsches Museum. Somebody said to me, you know, there's a JDC man here. By this time, I'd given up the idea that JDC or anybody else would come. And I walked out, and I looked down, and I saw this truck. There was a fellow, Yanko Levin, standing next to me, and I said, Yanko, there are 2 5-gallon cans of gas strapped to the sides of that truck. When he comes here to talk to me, take the cans of gas. And that is precisely what happened. That's how we met the joint. Eli Rock was a very nice fellow. And of course, his limitations was, here he was. We discussed, what are you going to do? He expressed his limitations. And it took quite some time until the problems were ironed out. And of course, as you move further and further into this period, the emergency is reduced in the sense that people are beginning to find their way and settle down into some type of a pattern. And so it wasn't until much later, after Rock came what's his name, Schwartz, and he couldn't accomplish anything. And after Schwartz came Levi Becker. Levi Becker's a very nice guy. See him from time to time. And there wasn't much that he could accomplish, but the programs were just beginning then. And then after Levy's period, then the joint began to, reach its stride, and
Well, this must have been in 46.
going into late 46, going into 47. Mm-hmm. And by that time, you're in a different ball game.
It's interesting, when you speak to people in the joint, they have the opposite attitude. That it was, the chaplains did very little, but it was the joint that did everything.
Well, it's all right if they want to take that position, except that they would have to establish one little fact. All you have to do is take the calendar and say, fine. Now, it's just as this story that I told you about. I read the story about a chaplain, and they tell a story about he came into the area in Germany, and he met a little girl, and he was helpful to her, and did this, and got her a job, and a year later, when she left for Israel, she said goodbye to him and thanked him. So you assume he was there for a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you say, where? I mean, after all, we were all there. I didn't see him or hear about him. I know the guy happens to be a friend of mine. Now, when you mention the name Lippmann, yes, I'll tell you where Lippmann was and so forth. You want to tell me Wall? I'll tell you where Wall was and so forth. You want to tell me Bonin? I'll tell you where he came and left, and, these are the periods and so forth. If joint makes a claim, fine. Did somebody come before Eli Rock? Who? Where? When did Eli Rock come? What did he come with? Which camps? When did your people come? I know the first 2 girls, and Borden was one that came, and C.O. Weinberg, who died recently. These are the first 2. Where were they attached, and so forth? Here's your date. You're down into September. You're down into October. Did you have offices? No. You used 3 Siebertstrasse. And then Eli Rock left because they thought he was ineffective. I mean, these are the... they can... as far as I'm concerned, they could say whatever they want. I'm not trying to...
No, I understand. I just wanted to point that out to you.
I'm not writing a story against joint. It's,
No,
if they want to tell their story, If I wanted to tell a story, I have enough material there to tell stories. I haven't told you all the really dramatic stories because it's not the fact of getting children out of Russia and bringing them to their parents, the famous Sakiki story, which has been dramatized, the Windle Child, and God knows how many dramatic moments in terms of experiences there. I wanted to sit down and tell the story, but the fact remains that if you took kind of circles in time in Germany and say, well, let's see who was in this circle at this time, you say, this is it. Here's Klausner, beginning in May of 45. Now, who else is in May, in that circle? Nobody. All right, let's take June now. Who's in the circle? Let's take July now. Who's in the circle? And the circle widens now. And it widens. And what's going on? Now you have the committee formed. Well, if you have a committee, did JDC have anything? Were they there? Were they, I mean, so forth and so on. And you go and you go and you keep widening and so forth. And then suddenly you see, fine, here's August. Eli Rock arrives in the circle. Where does he come?
August.
Well, whatever the date was. So here he comes. Where does he come to? He comes to the Deutsches Museum. Who's in the Deutsches Museum when he comes there? Klausner's there with his committee. Now that means I've already left Dachau. See, once I came into Munich, that was it. So I've given up working in Dachau because Dachau now is out. That means that the hospitals are all established. It means that Feldafing is established. And then later we made Landsberg into a Jewish camp, also with Richmond. And so here it becomes. Now, these are the people, and these are the plays, and so forth. I have no objection to it. Joint wants to write history for itself and tell us what happened, good. And then you can take Unser Weg, and you can see the first mention of Joint, and under what context, you see. It's all there, you know, the record is well established by now. All you have to do is, you know, a little detail here, a little detail there. It's not there.
Now, what about the passport system that you set up? Is that the same thing that we talked about before?
These, first of all, we used papers. In other words, the whole the travel permits and papers is all part of one thing. In other words, what I have discovered very quickly is that Europeans have tremendous respect for stamps. Stamps. And so we were able to reproduce any stamp that we saw. We had dozens of them. The more stamps you put on a piece of paper, you know...
Who did the stamp? Who did that? The inmates themselves?
Well, I got people to make the stamps, but I did the stamping. We finally worked out this system to a point where we actually printed passports. And there was a fellow, I remember his name was Prochnik. He was the one that perfected the final passport, where we got a passport that we could use to get out of Germany into Switzerland and so forth. In fact, I used it to get Zalman Grinberg, who was then the president, to come to the United States. He actually came to the United States without any authorization. It was a very embarrassing situation, and later we were investigated for. And it was a rather humorous investigation in the sense it started off seriously, but it was humorous in the sense that the inspectors realized that we weren't out to harm anyone. In fact, we were out to do some good. And in fact, when Grinberg came to the United States, he was received by the national Jewish organizations. He spoke at conventions and so forth. But what embarrassed them was that, as they pointed out to me, that if I could do that with Grinberg, think of how many of the leading Nazis could have been gotten out, which they were quite correct.
Yes, they did. Except
that my interest was to get this man to the United States so he could tell his story. And I proceeded on a basis that I had established for myself in terms of the movement of people. And it worked. So our system worked, but we never misused it in the sense of trying to sell a piece of paper or get somebody to go somewhere where it wasn't really proper. Basically, the papers were used for Eastern Europe. In other words, to get into Eastern Europe and to get people out, especially in the Russian areas. That's where the papers were used.
Is this part of the underground system?
No, this is our own little underground. Now, the other underground system, when you talk about the underground, here you're in another field. The chaplains were only aides in the underground system.
You mean this is part of Aliyah?
Everything. In other words, whatever chaplains were involved, this was always an aid. And there were all kinds of movements. There were the organized movements, the Aliyah Bet movements. Some of the ideological groupings wanted to run their own movements. Then there were people who were moving in and out. There were people fleeing. There were people that we organized, people that we sent in and came back, people who came to us and asked us to cover for them, Israelis and so forth, before Israel started. In other words, nothing was really simple in the sense that you had this job, I had that job, Aliyah and so forth. Everything was quite fragmented. I'll give you an example. When the Exodus was turned around, now this comes much later, I was then in Kassel. I was exiled, you see, from Munich. And this too is a story in itself.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah, I was exiled. And so I was sent to Kassel. But as matters turned out, Kassel now became a heavily populated Jewish center because the army now, having given in to the fact that Jews can come across the border after the advisors had fought this out, were now pushed north rather than south because Munich was heavily populated, and so they wanted them in the north, and so they were in the Kassel area. And I was now sent to the Kassel area. Here I was already a DP chaplain. See, this was my second stage. I didn't have to cover now. I was actually assigned as a DP chaplain. In Munich, I was never a DP chaplain. First of all, there were no such things as DP. The whole concept of DP chaplain came later when one of the advisors, I don't know which, had asked for DP chaplains, and DP chaplains were assigned.
Is that Bernstein?
I don't know, it may have been Bernstein, but this you can check out. How many DP chaplains were eventually assigned, I don't know. This is something you'd have to check. But I was one of them. So I was in the Kassel area, and now the Exodus was turned around and brought back to Hamburg. Actually, it wasn't in Hamburg, it was right off of two little towns called Amstau and Poppendorf. And I was asked by the underground to go up to Amstau and Poppendorf to see the lay of the land, what's going on and what can happen. And so I went. Now, how I went, what I did is also part of a strange story.
Let's hear
My
it.
cover. What was my cover? I went to the office of the chaplain's office in Frankfurt, and I told them that I had to go to Bremerhaven to conduct holiday services for the Jewish personnel. Here again, you have a strange situation. Normally they would say to me, well, what's the matter with Kassel? Don't you have Jewish personnel there? But here again, my ties with different people were such that if Klausner wants to go to Bremerhaven, let him go to Bremerhaven. And so I got good orders cut for me to go there, and I went there. And when I got there, the commanding officer's car was put at my disposal. And I went to Poppendorf. In fact, I took with me a woman who was a writer, a journalist for the Forwards. Very wonderful human being. And I got into the camps. The British were in charge of the camps, and it was quite difficult, but what happened was, when I got there, I asked to be admitted, and they asked me why. And I said that I'm a chaplain, and the holidays are here, and I have to discuss holiday procedures. So they told me that they had their own rabbis in the camp, didn't have any chaplains, why couldn't they conduct it? So I said, I have all the material, the books and so forth, and they answered and said, fine, give us the books and we will...
Yes, no.
So I said, that's fine, but after all, they're printed in the United States and so forth, and they have to be explained. And we kept at this, and in the meantime, the commanding officer of the camp had sent someone into the camp to inform the rabbinical group that I was there. Because shortly afterwards, as I was standing near the barbed wire, and they had a series of barbed wire fences, two men were coming towards me. One of them I'd recognize from Munich, the younger man, in our rabbinical group. And when they saw me, they began to motion and to wave and so forth, terribly excited. And when the commanding officer saw this, he realized that there was some relationship, and he let me into the camp. Actually, the reason why this rabbi was excited had nothing to do with my coming there or having any materials, which I didn't have really.
You didn't bring any?
No, I had no material. The reason he was excited was that he was going to conduct services, both at the two camps, at Poppendorf and Amsterdam. And he wanted to know the relationship between the two camps because of the law of the Eruv. How far could he walk, and whether there was a stream, and how he was to measure the distance and so forth. And he was terribly interested in me only for this reason, but at least it was enough to get me into the camp. Well, anyway, I got into the camp, and I walked about, and I was fed all kinds of messages. I became a kind of a bag to pick up all the messages of the various groups and so forth, and eventually left, and was threatened by the British. They had seen me pick up messages and so forth, and I produced one or two, and then I went on my way and delivered the messages, and returned to Bremerhaven. Of course, it was too many services because time had gone by, and there are certain personal elements there which we need not go into. And then I went back to Kassel. Now, shortly thereafter, I received word that the Exodus people will be funneled down through Kassel. Now, this is where my role actually comes in with the Bricha. We call it Bricha Aliyah. And I indicate this only to indicate to you the relationship of the chaplain to this kind of work. When I got word that they would come in, the understanding was that I was to receive them, I was to house them, and I was to see to it that they were to get from Kassel to Munich. And that was my job. How I was to do it, that became my responsibility. And so what I did was simply to go to one of our camps and set up an area in the camp for the people coming across into Kassel. Since I was a DP chaplain, I had all the rights of movement in camps and so forth. Everybody, of course, knew me quite well and knew my position. The only trouble I had with then was with JDC. It was interesting, the problem I had with JDC. I needed blankets. And JDC had a man up there, a fellow named Fishman.
Which Fishman?
I forget his first name. In fact, I'd known him for years before that. It was just coincidental that he was there. Very nice chap. And I went to him and I said to him, listen, we have these people coming and I need blankets. And you have a warehouse of blankets, because this was already later where JDC had brought in supplies. So he told me he wasn't authorized. He couldn't give me the blankets. He said, furthermore, he said, if you give the blankets to the people, you know what's going to happen. They're going to take the blankets with them. Some take the blankets and they make a garment out of it.
Yeah, but what did that bother them? They were being used.
Well, there'd be no blankets when they needed them, you see. In other words, the stock of blankets. So I threatened again, as usual, and said, fine, we'll get a truck and we'll ram down the doors and we'll get the blankets. And I said, take your choice. You want rammed doors and no blankets, or give me the blankets? And so he delivered the blankets to me. In other words, we got them. Since I determined how much food went into a camp, because being a member of the DP team, it was our job to count the people in the camp for rations. And the whole business of counting was quite interesting. And it was amusing to watch Army. That is the team. See, I was part of a big team now. And they used to send the team out, and they'd come to count, and I'd stand back, and I know exactly the number in the camp, and I knew what number we were going to offer. And they seriously would count. We'd have the people walk through the line once, twice, 3 times. Oh, they couldn't keep track of this situation. Then what would happen was that we'd take the extra rations. And these extra rations had to be delivered by all the camps. We had quite a number of people to this transition camp, and this food became their food. Then
Why, you couldn't have gotten something for them?
No. If they discovered that
Yeah,
the Exodus people are coming back,
I understand.
this would have been it would have destroyed the whole thing. Then I went to a transportation officer. Very nice chap. Now I have to go into a side story. And this is what happens with all these stories. When I came up to Kassel, I was just another officer.
Do you remember what year we're talking about now?
We're in 47.
Okay.
Except that the UNRWA people and everybody had heard about me.
Oh, sure.
And there was no welcoming mat out for me. In fact, UNRWA has been well established up there, and they resented my being there. I remember coming into the UNRWA house, and there was a card game going on between all these UNRWA people, and I walked around. Nobody would say hello to me. It was just... the only thing they pointed out to me later is that they had expected some huge individual to come in, some overbearing individual. What surprised them first was that this little fella came in. But still, they held their distance. But another thing happened, and that had to do with the commanding officer. The commanding officer of the post was keeping company with a woman. The chaplains in the area didn't like it because she was a German woman or one of the European women, and they knew that he was married. And for some reason he went about with her to formal occasions and so forth, and they resented this. And they made their resentment known, and he was antagonized. And so he then proceeded to get rid of all the chaplains. When I say get rid of them, is move them out into units away from Kassel. Now, I was not a chaplain in the sense of being on the staff as a chaplain. I was there as a DP chaplain now, attached to the DP section. However, he kept me in Kassel, which meant that I was the ranking chaplain. I was the lowest ranking officer, but I was still the ranking chaplain. He also said to me that if I would conduct the services on Sunday, the Christian services, that he would take care of everything, give me office space there, transportation and so forth. And so by virtue of this kind of dual relationship, I now had an entree into headquarters. And so now comes the transportation officer. He knows of my relationship to the commanding officer. And I said to him, you're having trouble with DPs, you got a lot of DPs. I'll help you get rid of them. Everybody wants to get rid of DPs, you see. Now, he doesn't know which DPs I'm going to get rid of. But he says, that's fine. What do you want me to do? So I said, it's very simple. Give me a train every morning. Every morning, give me a train to leave the Kassel station for Munich, a sealed train. Couldn't do that. He says, but I tell you what I can do. I can put cars on the train going to Munich every day. And so every morning we showed up at the railroad station with about the number of cars we needed, 2, 3, 4. We filled up the cars. We gave the leader a sealed envelope. In case this happens, in case that happens, this is what you're to do. And off the train went to Munich every day. Never ran into a problem. In fact, when I left Kassel, there was a fellow by the name of, I think his name was Bernstein. He wrote a book, a chaplain, The Eagle, the Flyer. He came to Israel later, and he was with the Air Corps. He has a book. I have a copy of it. I don't remember his name. He was a DP chaplain. And he had just been assigned towards the end of this period. And I took him to the station. I said, here's your train. Every morning you'll bring whatever people come across. You put them on the train. This is the procedure. Off it goes to Munich. Never had a problem. Now, what happened in Munich, that was no longer my responsibility.